All right, guys. So Bidenomics, right? Bidenomics is a strange concept that I'm hearing coming from this administration, in which they don't appear to be adhering to any laws of economics or have any basic economic understanding of anything, right? They're making absolute statements about economics when you should never make absolute statements in regards to economics, because economics is simply the study of human behavior, right? And as humans, we are irrational and thus unpredictable, which in my opinion means that you probably should not make absolute statements about anything when it comes to economics, in my opinion, okay? But the Biden administration is not straying away from that, right? As they have a $3.5 trillion infrastructure package to sell people, right? And I did a video yesterday about how a Washington Post journalist went on TV and essentially made the argument that spending $3.5 trillion would essentially cost nothing, right? It would cost nothing because it's paid for by the rich, right? That's what they say. Okay, it would cost nothing. Even though you spend $3.5 trillion, don't worry. It costs you nothing because, we paid for it, right? That's the argument here. Okay, and the Biden administration has actually come out and endorsed this, right? They're now saying that the $3.5 trillion that they want to spend will cost nothing. Don't worry about it, right? That's the argument that they're making here. And anybody with, some common sense understands that's not grounded in reality, right? Everything costs something, right? Nothing is free, right? The Democrats are trying to present solutions when there is no solutions. They're just trade-offs, right? That's from Thomas Sowell, right? There are no solutions, simply just trade-offs. And that is so true in economics. So with that being said, the Democrats are making even more wild economic claims, as now they're saying that increases in corporate tax rates will not be passed on to consumers and prices. Matter of fact, Jen Psaki said it was absurd to think that would happen and that people would be pissed if companies actually did that. Now, I want you guys to actually listen to what she said, and then I'm going to give you guys my analysis. Take a look.
I want to ask you about what Republicans are pointing to in the analysis from the Joint Committee on Taxation. They say, according to, if I've read the chart correctly, more than 16% of taxpayers would see their taxes increase under the bill that's approved by the House Ways and Means Committee. Will the president sign that bill as it is coming out of that committee, or will he insist on the changes so that he will maintain his commitment that taxes won't go up on people making $400,000 a year?
I have not looked at the document or the report that you have put out. Obviously, the president, or that you have referenced, I should say, that the Republicans put out. Obviously, the president's commitment remains not raising taxes for anyone making less than $400,000 a year. There are some, and I'm not sure if this is the case in this report, who argue that in the past, companies have passed on these costs to consumers. I'm not sure if that's the argument being made in this report. We feel that that's unfair and absurd, and the American people would not stand for that. But I will take a closer look at this report and get you a more substantive response. Go ahead, Jack.
All right, guys. So there's a couple ways to interpret what Miss Jen Psaki is trying to say there, right? The first way is what everybody thinks she's saying, which is the idea that it is absurd to think that companies would pass on tax increases to consumers in the form of higher prices on goods and services, right? Basically, what she's saying is that the idea that companies raise prices in response to tax increases, corporate tax increases, is absurd. That's the first way to interpret what she's saying. The second way to interpret what she's saying is that, well, it's absurd for companies to do that, right? And that people would get upset if they decided to pass on the cost of increased corporate taxes to consumers in the form of high prices. She's not necessarily saying that it doesn't happen, that corporations don't pass on the cost of tax increases to consumers in the form of high prices. But what she's actually really saying is that it will be bad for them, I guess, from a moral standpoint, right? Or a goodwill standpoint to do that with consumers, and that people wouldn't be happy if they did that, right? So those are the two ways to interpret what he's saying. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to assume that she's going with the first interpretation, right? Which is that companies do not increase consumer prices in response to corporate tax increases. So let's get into this. First of all, I just want people to understand that corporations are simply made up of people, right? So any taxes on a corporation is essentially taxing people. These taxes are split between companies and consumers. That's kind of how it works. Now, a mistake that I'm seeing on the right is that a lot of people are making absolute statements as an argument against corporate tax increases, right? They're saying things like, well, any corporate tax increases will just be passed on to consumers at higher prices. Companies are just going to raise their prices, and just, the customers, they're all going to be the ones that's going to pay, right? When that claim is also just as absurd as the claim that Jen Psaki makes, if you're interpreting this way, that companies don't pass on tax increases to consumers. Now, again, that's why I said at the beginning of this video that people have to be careful when they're talking about economics and making these statements in extremes, because 99% of the time, the answer is actually in the middle. So the question of whether or not companies pass on tax increases to consumers, it really just is, it just depends, right? It just depends on the situation, right? Because you have this concept, guys, in economics called the elasticity of demand. And the elasticity of demand simply just measures the responsiveness of quantity demanded of a certain good or service in response to price. So the elasticity of demand plays an important factor in determining the price that consumers are willing to pay for a good or service, which again in turn determines the price that firms can set for a good or a service, right? Unless you are a monopolist, okay, you can't just arbitrarily set any price on the market that you want and expect people to pay. That's not how it works, right? That's not how it works. And even if you are a monopolist, you still, even though theoretically you can set whatever price you want if you have a good that's a necessity, it may get too high to the point where people just choose not to pay, right? Again, that's just kind of how things work. Because in a competitive free market situation, guys, let's say that the government decided to increase taxes on, all these firms, right? Well, what happens is that in certain industries, yes, you're going to have some companies that decide that, we're going to try to pass on these tax increases to consumers directly, right? Because we don't want to cut workers or cut hours or anything like that or decrease our profits. We want to just pass on to consumers. They can choose to do that. However, there's a company in that same industry that's trying to compete, right? That could decide that, we will just eat some of the profits in order to keep our prices low, right? And because of that, consumers may decide to go and shop at that firm that actually kept prices low and decided to eat the profits, okay, from that tax increase, which could result in that firm actually making more profits. Even though their margins might be less, their overall profit might be more, right? And companies are always going to set prices to maximize profit. And that is why companies just can't arbitrarily increase prices. And again, keep in mind, the key word is arbitrarily. That doesn't mean that they can't do it. It just means that in a competitive situation, it may or may not happen. It just depends. Now, could a whole industry decide that in response to tax increases that they're going to increase prices? Sure, right? And that they're going to pass it all to the consumer? Sure. That could happen in situations where they're monopolistic firms. Sure, right? That is going to happen, right? But I guess what I'm saying is that it depends. And I think conservatives should be careful about presenting this argument in response to corporate tax increases, because in my opinion, it's honestly the weakest argument to present against this, because it doesn't always happen that way, because we have competitive free markets. A lot of times, the increase in corporate taxes is going to be split between company and the consumers, right? It's going to be split. Both of them are going to eat it. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to present some better arguments that conservatives should use against increasing corporate taxes that revolves around what happens in a competitive market when companies are trying to compete and they have to adjust to corporate tax increases, right? The effect that it's going to have on workers, okay, and the effect that lower profits have on companies and their shareholders, and how that has an overall effect on society as a whole, right? Those are much better arguments, right? As a 2016 study found that shareholders and owners bear around 40% of state corporate income taxes, while employees bear 30 to 35%. So even though a corporate tax rate is not directly levied on workers, what happens, guys, is that they still affect workers indirectly by lowering wages, which is what some companies will have to do if they don't want to increase prices to stay competitive. And, shareholders want to continue to maintain their profit margins, right? Another study from 2018 also finds that state corporate tax increases harm the labor market. The authors analyzed counties that border one another but are in different states and find that counties in states with higher corporate tax rates have less employment and lower wage income. Again, this study right here essentially showing, like the last study I showed you guys, that some of the negative effects from a corporate tax increase is going to go on workers, right? It's going to go on workers. So I just want you guys to understand that in response to corporate tax increases, companies don't just automatically increase prices on consumers, because a lot of them don't really want to in a competitive situation because of the elasticity of demand. Again, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm simply saying that that's not the best argument against corporate tax increases. So again, this is why I'm making this video, because I think conservatives are just making bad arguments in regards to this whole corporate tax increase thing. Another argument that conservatives should be making in regards to not increasing the corporate tax rate is what happens when you increase the corporate tax rate. If it results in lower profits for firms, right? Again, in competitive situations that could happen, that affects the broader market as a whole, because if shareholders are getting less profits, then that is going to impact stock returns. And keep in mind, guys, over half of Americans are invested through their retirement plans in the stock market, right? They're invested in corporate America. So when corporate America suffers, half of America's retirement savings suffer, right? So reducing corporate profits is going to hurt the average day American's retirement funds. Why do y'all think that after Trump's tax cuts, the stock market took off, right? Because corporate profits were higher, right? Which means greater returns for shareholders, okay? It's kind of what happens, right? Also, another argument against corporate tax increases is that they decrease R&D and innovation, right? As there was a 2017 study that found that increasing state corporate taxes reduce future innovation, and that higher corporate taxes reduce patenting, R&D investment, and new product introductions. So, I mean, there's some strong evidence, at the very least on the state level, that corporate tax increases aren't necessarily good for the economy. It actually hurts the economy and companies overall and workers, okay? So I don't know why Biden right now is trying to consider increasing corporate tax rates, considering how the economy is kind of sputtering under him, right? That's the last thing I would probably be considering doing right now at this moment. But hey, I guess the whole point of my video is that, I just feel like, I see a lot of people on the right make this overly simplistic argument that, well, any increases in taxes, right? Corporate tax rate is just going to be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. And I just think that that's not a great argument to be making, because it's not always true, right? It's not always true, and it's much more complicated than that. And I think there are better arguments to be made against increasing the corporate tax rate than the argument of that it just is going to equal higher prices automatically, because that's not necessarily how competitive markets work. Now, like I said, if it's a more monopolistic market, sure, that's probably going to be true. That's probably exactly what they're going to do, right? Because they have monopolistic power over the market. They can do that, right? But like I said, I just think that in general, I just wanted to present you guys some other arguments against increasing the corporate tax rate so that you guys get a better understanding of some of this stuff. But that's just me, right? I usually don't do videos that are this in depth, and I try to keep it as simple as I can. But let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.